What if I told you that the battle over Edgar Lungu's body is far from over? Esther Lungu has now made a final decision, and it has shocked Zambia. For weeks, we've seen court battles, family disputes, and political tensions between the Lungu family and President Hakainde Hichilema's government. But Esther's latest move could change everything about where, how, and even if Edgar Lungu is laid to rest. Stay with us, because what you're about to hear may be the most dramatic twist yet in Zambia's most controversial burial battle. The burial of Edgar Lungu, Zambia's former president, has become one of the most heated and controversial political stories in recent history. Now, Esther Lungu has given her final word on how Lungu's body should be handled, a decision that has left Zambia divided. In this video, we uncover Esther Lungu's shocking position on Edgar Lungu's body, the hidden truth behind the burial drama, why this decision has sparked tension with President Hakainde Hichilema, HH, and the Zambian government, what this means for the Lungu family's legacy and Zambia's political future. Watch until the end, because this is not just about a burial. It's about power, truth, and Zambia's destiny. The widow's silence in the days following the sudden death of former Zambian President Edgar Lungu, the nation waited. Newspapers ran headlines of uncertainty, television anchors spoke in hushed tones, and Zambians across the world whispered the same question: where is Esther? The former First Lady, once the most visible woman in the country, known for her public charity work and strong presence at her husband's side, had vanished into silence. Weeks passed, but she said nothing. No official statement, no public appearance, not even a whispered comment to the press. For a grieving widow, this silence might have seemed natural. But in Zambia's tense political climate, Esther's absence created a storm of speculation. Some believed she was too broken by grief to face the cameras. Others insisted she was carefully calculating her next move, waiting for the right moment to speak. And still, others whispered darker theories that her silence was not by choice, but by force. Inside Lusaka, her silence grew louder than any speech. At every funeral meeting, her empty chair drew stares. At every press conference, journalists demanded answers. Where was Esther? Why was she not leading the mourning? Behind the scenes, sources claim, she was under immense pressure. Members of the family clashed over funeral arrangements. Political figures circled, each trying to use Lungu's death to shape their narrative. And at the center of it all, Esther was caught in an impossible position, torn between her role as widow, mother, and the guardian of her husband's legacy. When she finally broke her silence, the words carried weight far beyond mourning. They revealed not only her grief, but her defiance, and they set the stage for a burial drama unlike anything Zambia had ever seen. This was no longer just about laying a man to rest. It was about power, memory, and the fight over who gets to tell Zambia's history. The battle over a body as the nation mourned Edgar Lungu, another conflict was unfolding, hidden behind closed doors, whispered in courtrooms, and argued in hushed voices within Lusaka's corridors of power. The question was deceptively simple: where should Edgar Lungu be buried? But the answers tore families, institutions, and even the nation apart. For President Hakainde Hichilema's government, the solution was clear. As a former head of state, Edgar Lungu deserved a state funeral, complete with military honors, official ceremonies, and a burial at Embassy Park, where Zambia's presidents are laid to rest. To them, this was not just a question of respect, but of national protocol. But to Esther Lungu, the widow, it was not that simple. Sources close to the family claim she wanted her husband buried privately, far from political spectacle, far from the hands of those she believed had betrayed him. To her, this was not only a family matter, but an issue of dignity, a refusal to let the state rewrite her husband's story. The standoff grew intense. Lawyers were called in. Clergy were consulted. Even traditional leaders weighed in, warning that the burial of a leader carried spiritual consequences for the nation. Meanwhile, the public watched in confusion. Rumors filled the air. Was the government trying to control the narrative of Lungu's death? Was the family hiding secrets about his final days? And why was his body still being held in South Africa as negotiations raged on back home? The battle over Edgar Lungu's body revealed something deeper: that death does not end politics. If anything, it magnifies it. His burial site would not just mark the resting place of a man, it would symbolize the future of his legacy and perhaps the balance of power in Zambia itself. And in the middle of this storm stood Esther Lungu, holding on tightly to her husband's memory, even as the state insisted on its right to claim him. The stage was set. What began as a funeral was about to become a national showdown. secrets of the South African morgue. While Zambia was gripped by debate over Edgar Lungu's burial, another mystery was quietly unfolding hundreds of miles away in South Africa. In a sterile morgue in Pretoria, the former president's body lay under guard, not for days, but for weeks. Officially, the reason given was logistical delays. But to many, that explanation raised more questions than it answered. Why was the body not flown home immediately? What was happening inside that morgue? Whispers began to circulate. Some claimed there had been a secret autopsy, one that revealed details the family or state did not want made public. Others suggested that South African courts had issued a hidden order preventing the release of the body until disputes over burial were resolved. And then there were those who believed something even darker, that the truth of Lungu's final moments was being deliberately concealed. The South African morgue became more than just a holding place. It became a stage for rumors, suspicion, and political intrigue. Journalists camped outside, hoping for a glimpse of movement. Officials from both Zambia and South Africa kept tight-lipped, fueling speculation further. For Esther Lungu, this period was agonizing. Not only was she mourning her husband, but she was also fighting for control of his legacy while his body lay far from home. Every delay deepened her mistrust. Every rumor added fuel to her suspicion that her husband's memory was being manipulated. Back in Zambia, the public's patience wore thin. Citizens asked, "Why can't a former president be brought home with dignity? What are our leaders hiding from us?" The morgue in Pretoria became the silent witness to a storm of secrets. And in its cold chambers lay the one figure who could no longer speak for himself. As the days dragged on, one thing became clear. Edgar Lungu's body was no longer just a matter of mourning. It was evidence in a political struggle that was quickly spiraling out of control. Esther's shocking declaration. For weeks, Zambia waited in suspense. Esther Lungu, the widow of the late president, had remained silent as rumors swirled. Would she yield to the government's call for a state funeral? Would she allow Edgar's body to be buried at Embassy Park alongside Zambia's other leaders? Or would she resist? When she finally spoke, her words cut through the silence like a blade. In a carefully prepared statement, Esther declared that her husband would not be buried under the shadow of politics. She rejected the idea of a state funeral, insisting instead on a private ceremony, a burial away from the cameras, away from the official fanfare, and most importantly, away from those she accused of betraying her husband in life. Her declaration stunned the nation. To her supporters, it was an act of courage, a widow protecting her husband's dignity against a government she did not trust. To her critics, it was defiance, even disrespect, toward the office of the presidency and the traditions of the state. But beyond the surface, Esther's words carried a hidden weight. This was not just grief speaking, it was politics cloaked in mourning. In her message, many heard a direct challenge to President Hakainde Hichilema's government, a refusal to let the state rewrite Edgar Lungu's legacy. Her statement shifted the national conversation. No longer was this just about funeral logistics. It became about power, legitimacy, and memory. Who truly owns the story of a president once he is gone? The state that he served, or the family he leaves behind? For Esther, the answer was clear. Her husband belonged to his family, not the politicians. And by voicing that conviction, she turned a personal tragedy into a public battle. Her shocking declaration ensured that Edgar Lungu's burial would not be a quiet farewell. Instead, it marked the beginning of a drama that would test Zambia's politics, its traditions, and its understanding of respect for the dead. The state versus the family. The moment Esther Lungu rejected a state funeral, the battle lines were drawn. What had once been a private mourning process now erupted into a very public confrontation between the Zambian state and the Lungu family. On one side stood President Hakainde Hichilema's government. To them, Edgar Lungu was not just a husband or father. He was a former head of state, and by tradition, all former presidents are laid to rest at Embassy Park with full honors. Anything less, they argued, would dishonor the office of the presidency itself. But on the other side was Esther Lungu and her family. For them, this was not about titles or protocol. This was about trust and dignity. Esther believed that allowing the state to take charge meant surrendering her husband's memory to those she accused of persecuting him in life. Her refusal was more than personal grief. It was a stand against what she saw as hypocrisy. Behind the scenes, the standoff grew tense. Cabinet ministers pushed for swift arrangements, insisting the nation deserved closure. Lawyers entered the fray, drafting legal arguments about burial rights. Church leaders appealed for peace, urging both sides to set aside politics in the name of respect. But neither side moved. The government argued that the body of a president belonged to the nation. The family insisted it belonged to the household first. And in this clash of principles, Edgar Lungu's body remained suspended, a symbol of a deeper struggle over who controls history. For ordinary Zambians, the conflict was disorienting. Some sympathized with Esther, believing she had every right to decide her husband's resting place. Others sided with the government, warning that bending tradition for one leader could set a dangerous precedent. What became clear was this: the burial of Edgar Lungu was no longer about mourning a man. It was about power, precedent, and the fragile balance between state authority and family rights. The struggle was far from over, and with every passing day, the question grew louder: who would win the fight for Edgar Lungu's final chapter? Political ghosts of the past. As arguments over Edgar Lungu's burial deepened, something became undeniable. This was no longer just about where a man should rest. It was about the ghosts of Zambia's political past and the way history itself was being rewritten. For years, Edgar Lungu's presidency was a lightning rod of controversy. To his supporters, he was a man of the people, a humble leader who rose from modest beginnings. To his critics, he was the face of corruption, authoritarianism, and economic decline. His sudden death reopened all those debates, and his burial became the stage on which those arguments played out. The government, led by President Hakainde Hichilema, wanted Lungu remembered with dignity, but also within a controlled narrative. A state funeral at Embassy Park would place him among Zambia's presidents, but under the careful script of official ceremony. Critics warned this was an attempt to sanitize Lungu's legacy, presenting him as a national figure while downplaying the controversies of his rule. Meanwhile, Esther Lungu resisted. To her, the state was attempting to own her husband in death after vilifying him in life. By demanding a private burial, she was not just grieving, she was defying a system she believed wanted to bury not only her husband's body, but his true story. This clash was about more than one man. It echoed Zambia's long history of political rivalries, from a shadow of Kenneth Kanda's towering legacy to the contested memories of Frederick Chiluba and other past leaders. Each burial had carried political weight. Lungu's, however, seemed to reopen wounds that had never healed. The country became divided once more. Was Lungu a victim of political persecution even in death? Or was Esther using grief as a shield to protect his tarnished record? In the battle over Edgar Lungu's body, Zambia was really fighting over something deeper, the story of who gets to define its leaders, its history, and its truth. And as the political ghosts of the past returned, it became clear the struggle for Lungu's legacy was only beginning. Hidden allies, hidden enemies. As Zambia watched the burial standoff unfold, it became clear that Esther Lungu was not fighting alone, nor was the government. Behind every public statement and legal move, a network of hidden allies and silent enemies worked in the shadows, shaping the drama from the outside. At the heart of Esther's camp were her lawyers. Led by trusted figures like Makibi Zulu, they argued fiercely that the family's rights came before the state's traditions. To them, this was not only about law, but about protecting a widow from being silenced by politics. The church, too, played a complicated role. Some clergy offered Esther comfort, supporting her insistence on a private burial, while others urged her to compromise for the sake of national unity. Their divided voices reflected a deeper truth. Even Zambia's moral authority was split. But Esther's allies were not only local. Whispers spread of foreign voices weighing in. Some South African contacts, sympathetic to her plight, reportedly offered support during the Morgue delays. Meanwhile, international observers quietly monitored the drama, aware that the burial of a former president could ripple far beyond Zambia's borders. On the other side, the government had its own network. Advisors close to President Hakainde Hichilema framed the burial as a matter of state dignity, warning that bending to the family's will would weaken the presidency itself. Security services stood ready to enforce state orders if necessary, signaling just how high the stakes had risen. Yet, within both camps, not everyone was loyal. Some insiders whispered to the media, leaking details of private meetings. Others shifted allegiances, playing both sides to protect their own interests. Hidden enemies existed not just outside but within, making the struggle even more unpredictable. For the public, these unseen forces fueled the sense of mystery. Who was truly guiding Esther? Who was advising the president? And most importantly, who stood to benefit from prolonging the chaos? In this episode of Zambia's unfolding drama, it became clear The fight over Edgar Lungu's body was never just between Esther and the state. It was a chess match with invisible hands moving pieces across the board. The final resting place after weeks of silence, confrontation, and courtroom whispers, the question that haunted Zambia finally demanded an answer. Where would Edgar Lungu be laid to rest? For some, the only fitting place was Embassy Park, the resting ground of Zambia's presidents. To bury him anywhere else, they argued, would diminish his place in history. For others, especially Esther Lungu, the idea felt like betrayal, placing him under the care of a state that, in her view, had turned against him in his final years. The decision was not just about geography, it was about symbolism. Embassy Park meant inclusion in Zambia's official story. A private burial, in contrast, meant defiance, a statement that his memory belonged to his family and loyal supporters, not the government. When the final arrangements were revealed, emotions ran high. Crowds gathered in Lusaka, some in mourning, others in protest. For many Zambians, the burial site became a mirror of their own feelings toward Lungu: pride, anger, grief, or relief. But wherever his body was finally laid, the truth was undeniable. Edgar Lungu's resting place became more than a grave. It became a battlefield of meaning. His supporters would forever point to it as evidence of a leader wronged. His critics would see it as closure to a controversial chapter. And for the nation, it would remain a reminder that even in death, a leader's influence lingers. For Esther Lungu, the outcome was bittersweet. She had fought to guard her husband's memory, to resist what she saw as political exploitation. Yet she also knew the battle had changed her forever, transforming her from a grieving widow into a central figure in Zambia's most contested funeral. In the end, the burial of Edgar Lungu was not simply the end of a life. It was the beginning of a story that will shape Zambia for years to come. A story of power, memory, and the unending struggle over who owns the truth of a nation's history.